now that things are marrying up a little bit.
Yeah.
I think we can begin. I know other folks might be joining us a little bit later, but welcome everyone and good morning. Thanks for joining. Just for those that are joining remotely, we do have others here in person. You just don't see them on the camera, but you may hear them. Yeah, you may hear them, and we may be looking that way. So I wanted you to know that fact. And we could expand the camera, but then it gets to be too wide angle. But with that, my name is Schalewski. For those that don't know me, I serve as Director of Assessment Research within SSRI. And Kendra, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll Marla.
Yeah, I'm Kendra Thompson-Dyke, and I work with Lucas. I'm a Senior Research Analyst in Assessment and Research.
And Marla, if you want to begin with introducing this session and maybe how it came to be, I think that'd be a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Marla Franco, and I serve as the Assistant Vice Provost for Hispanic Serving Institution initiatives here at the University of Arizona, also with the faculty affiliate appointment with the Center for the Study of Higher Education in our College of Ed. So I'm really excited to be invited to certainly collaborate on this presentation. It's always great to see other areas throughout our university, really, taking that intentionality to center servingness within their respective scope and responsibility. So thank you so much for your leadership in thinking about its intersections as it relates to assessment. And so today's presentation is certainly inspired by that collective and collaborative work. And so we're focusing on really how to assess structures for serving, and really what are those indicators, of servingness at an HSI. We'll be able to kind of cruise through, I think, a number of examples to illustrate, in practice what that looks like. And then also, before that, really kind of taking a look at some of the frameworks that have helped, I think, inspire what exactly we should might be examining. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're just working on the clicker over here, so.
There we go.
Oh, yay, we got it. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so we just wanted to give you a big picture overview of what we will kind of lead you through. And we really are looking forward as well to some conversation towards the end. We would love to certainly, kind of pick your brain and hear your thoughts, certainly kind of, I think, navigate through some challenges related to doing this work, but then also some ideas. So we will cover some conceptual frameworks for understanding servingness that are out there. Certainly talk about some equity-minded assessment frameworks along with some HSI explicit ones. And then really kind of talk through, what are those structures and indicators potentially to determine the extent to which we really are serving our students from diverse populations. Of particular interest, of course, is our Latinx Hispanic population, first-generation college students, Pell-eligible students. And then certainly some recommendations for practice, right? So making sure that we really hit on that practical utility piece during our session this morning. And then applying learning towards your assessment practice, right? Because as we assess, I think oftentimes what gets uncovered are some practices that might be working exceptionally well, that are helping us gauge, indicators of servingness. But then also things that will likely and should illuminate some opportunities for improvement, right? And greater intentionality. And so, knowing that that's what this process is aimed to do, right? And then certainly hoping to engage in some dialogue and some Q&A around the conversation this morning. So what is Servingness within a Hispanic Serving Institution? I think that we want to foreground the conversation, with some general consensus, and also really kind of leveraging what we know from research and conceptual and theoretical frameworks around this topic. So really, I think in our own kind of collective words, right, servingness means that we are intentionally strengthening the structures and conditions needed to responsibly support the needs of students with diverse backgrounds, particularly our Hispanic Latinx students, but certainly not exclusive. I did mention some of the other dimensions of student identities and background characteristics that are often important to look at in examining practices relative to our HSI designation. For those of you who may not necessarily be as familiar with the designation, that comes to us by way of the U.S. Department of Education. And really, the primary set of criteria for becoming a federally designated HSI is really solely limited to an enrollment metric, right? And so that enrollment metric is 25%, at least 25% undergraduate Hispanic enrollment. There are some additional dimensions to the criteria, although that is the primary one, the non-negotiable one. The other pieces do relate to kind of a campus's, a university's proportion of Pell eligible students, as well as it also kind of looks at some of the budget related to an institution. And so really that leaves us not with a whole lot of guidance or understanding around the depth of scope at which we should be practicing and manifesting this work at our respective institutions. And therefore we have to, I think, do some serious thought and introspection ourselves, as well as certainly grab and engage onto the research that is out there, certainly a growing body of research focused on HSIs, as well as other relevant conceptual and theoretical frameworks and research that help us apply an equity lens to the work that we do. So not only is being an HSI about access and really enrollment to a college or university, right? That is an essential piece. And that's often the piece that results in the main qualifier, right? But what else? There's so much more to being a Hispanic Serving Institution than enrollment, than access. There should be. So what does that mean? We have to think about the collective holistic environment, right, that our students experience when they are here at our educational institutions, right? What are the ways in which they are educationally enhancing, right, welcoming, asset-based, right, affirming of their own aspects of their respective identities at the intersections of those identities. And so how is it culturally affirming, right, and responsive to what their needs are? So that's kind of that middle part of this equation. And then the other dimension that often helps us kind of be a litmus test as to whether or not we are serving these students well is to look at not only the experiences that they have here, but those experiences in relation to their outcomes, right? So equitable opportunities and outcomes. We want to ensure that there's equitable access to opportunities, as well as equitable outcomes relative to their peers. And there's a whole host of outcomes that I know that many of us are certainly, there's your kind of tried and true outcomes, right, like retention and graduation rates, but it's also so much more than those two metrics, right? And so collectively, all of this is really undergirded by this culturally relevant and responsive approach as well, right? That's got to encompass the full component of this equation. So one of the frameworks that exists that really has been informing the work, Dr. Gina Garcia and colleagues in 2019 published what's called the Multidimensional Conceptual Framework for Understanding Servingness in Hispanic Serving Institutions. And this is probably, what has gotten us to really further understand the depths and scopes of the full ecosystem, right, that influences the experience that our students might have at HSIs, right? And it also, I think, demonstrates that there are relationships between these things, and there's a level of influence that some of these things have on the types of experiences and outcomes that we want our students to achieve, right? They either help facilitate those outcomes that we want students to achieve, but let's be real, for many of these types of experiences, they may also impede the success that we want our students to experience. And so how do we begin through our assessment strategies to identify those levers, right? And assess them in a way that determines, right, what is working to help facilitate student success among Latinx students. What is working, right, and under what conditions, and what does it look like? What's the intentionality around it in the ways that it's been designed, delivered, and utilized to support student success? So here in this multidimensional conceptual framework, it identifies, I think several things worth noting, right? But I think in many ways, this identifies what those levers are. So there's Dr. Garcia identifies that there's external influences that really kind of influence, right, servingness at an institution. I think perhaps maybe, for us, thinking about some of the state legislation within the state of Arizona, for those that might be joining us from other states throughout the US, thinking about your institutional context within the context of a state and state policies and state laws, and even kind of state priorities and resources dedicated and earmarked to higher education institutions, and particularly Hispanic serving institutions, right? Even thinking about state governing boards, right? For here in Arizona, we have an Arizona Board of Regents that serves as a governing body across the 3 4-year public universities. And so thinking about the things that they are engaged in, levels of advocacy around the work that they do, priorities that they have for the 3 state institutions, right? And ways in which that influences the priorities that make their way to a localized level here at the University of Arizona. So you've got this external influence, right? We could kind of go through lots of different examples as to what that looks like on the ground here. We also have structures for serving. Okay, so those are things within our respective institutions, right, that serve as levers that I think have the potential to either facilitate or impede some of the outcomes that we'd like to see towards the bottom, right? They also have influence on that kind of bottom left box regarding the experiences, either validating experiences, racialized experiences, right, within the structures. So thinking about structures for servingness, right, I mean, these might be things like our university's mission and values. They might be our institution's strategic plan. They might be grants that we have from federal agencies that are specifically earmarked for HSIs. Our leadership and the decision-making practices that our leadership here at the University of Arizona has. What are the incentive structures for faculty, staff, administrators, right, to be engaged, committed, and intentional around servingness? So all of those things, right, serve as levers. And so thinking about those pieces and ways in which we might kind of assess those conditions, the extent to which they're intentional around serving diverse student populations. On the top, right-hand side, Dr. Gina Garcia identified white supremacy, right? And that is kind of an overarching, right, impact that all of this exists in, and right? So, we have to be thinking about kind of the white normative structures, white normative practices, white normative policies, the ways in which whiteness shows up in all of these dimensions, right? Many of our, nearly all of our Hispanic serving institutions, not exclusively all of them, but many of them, right, started out as predominantly white institutions. And so we often have this, threshold of enrollment that we crossed, right, that then had us become a federally designated HSI, but it's not like magically that day that happens, right? You no longer exist within these, white structures, right? And so how do we think critically about that? And then also, you know, what are both the validating experiences within the structures for students, as well as the racialized experiences that often, you know, we hear in a case-by-case situation or collectively across campus through campus climate surveys and other things, ways in which those racialized experiences, you know, express devalue for our students and their heritage, their background, their language, their culture, their aspects of their identity, right? And all of that collectively, you know, has influence on both academic and non-academic outcomes that we seek for our students. And so how do we collectively think about this whole ecosystem relative to our assessment strategies? So why should we assess servingness, right? I think that's a really important question, you know, to make sure that we understand the why, right? Before we go into something. And so there's both, I think, an accountability perspective, you know, part of the conversation to have around this, as well as a continuous improvement conversation to have around this, right? I mean, I think that we want to be good and intentional stewards of this designation. And so how can we hold our own selves accountable collectively across our institution for being accountable towards this work and really serving students in a way that grounds aspects of their identity in affirming and culturally enhancing ways. And so from an accountability perspective, you know, how do we know that our university, that our departments, that our academic degree programs, our services are committed to servingness, right? What are the ways in which we can also demonstrate servingness to stakeholders? And when we think about stakeholder groups, students should be part of that stakeholder group. So how do we even demonstrate accountability to students, right? To the students that we enroll, that we're serving them in ways that are responsive to their own needs. But certainly the stakeholder group is you know, quite extensive, right? We could go down a list of who our stakeholders are. And from a continuous improvement, you know, perspective, right? That's also a key hallmark of assessment in general. But I think a very much needed approach as it relates to HSI initiatives and the ways in which this work manifests with intentionality at our respective institutions. And so we should be constantly thinking on this continuous improvement process. How can servingness be strengthened? And identify areas for improvement to advance servingness more effectively, more intentionally, right? And to identify assets across our campus where, you know, perhaps maybe some of that work is help you know, working exceptionally well, helping to model what the potential for what that work could look like, you know, across the university. And, you know, definitely kind of utilizing some of those findings to pinpoint to people like myself, right? What additional, you know, capacity building efforts, training, professional development, coaching can we do across units so that our ability to do this type of work with great intentionality is strengthened. So how do we assess servingness? And this is where I will kind of segue over to Lucas.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marla. So moving forward into going from why to how, I think we really look to this helpful framework, the continuum of equity-minded assessment from Henning and Lundquist, who right now are re-envisioning this in an upcoming equity-centered assessment book in higher education. But what's helpful here is to look at this continuum that goes from causing harm to reducing bias, culturally responsive assessment, socially just assessment, deconstructed assessment, and assessment for social justice and decolonization is really aligned with assessing and supporting servingness with the ideas of accountability and continuous improvement in mind. Right, so it's really, you know, key here where we're not intentional about how we're doing our assessment efforts. We could actually unintentionally cause harm. So we need to be thoughtful about that when assessing these structures and indicators of servingness. And we'll be providing different examples of what this type of assessment looks like for the remaining presentation. And we hope to hear from you about what type of examples and practices you have in place. One quote that I think is super helpful that really wraps up what equity-minded assessment is at its core, equitable assessment calls for those who lead and participate in assessment activities to pay attention and be conscious of how assessment can either feed into cycles that perpetuate inequities or can serve to bring more equity into higher education. So it speaks to my earlier point of intention in terms of how assessment practices take shape. And with a focus on that intention, we'll first kind of talk through examples of assessing structures for serving. Now, these are examples at the University of Arizona, and some are department, division, university, center, but we really hope you can take these and apply them in your own context. So for example, this particular structure is really focused on strategic plan goals or key performance indicators, KPIs. A lot of universities and divisions and departments likely have these in place. Right now on the screen, you're seeing University of Arizona's self-determined Arizona Board of Regents Student Success Goal, which is really focused on increasing our Pell Arizona resident 6-year completion rates, as well as our diverse student 6-year Arizona resident completion rates. This is great to see, right? This is really what we want to see from an equity lens and should be continuing this work because it helps us identify on the chart that you're seeing in front of you that we do have some opportunity gaps or equity gaps there, and that we have to relook at our policies, our practices, our systems for servingness, and really have that continuous improvement model in mind so we can start making progress on this. So I would ask a question rhetorically for now, how do you have these type of KPIs, goals, or strategic plans in place that really embody that idea of servingness and HSI designation? Really kudos to our University Analytics Institutional Research Team, or UAIR, at University of Arizona. In the past couple of years, they've really been able to provide some really helpful public information that we didn't always have and have to have. And a lot of universities don't have this publicly available through their Factbook, which is an interactive dashboard. So this is really focused on the structure for serving of compositional diversity, where you can disaggregate our enrollment by different populations, undergraduate, graduate, professional, residency, and start to see those changes over time. Similarly, with compositional diversity, it's not just about our student population, it also includes our staff and faculty demographics. And again, thanks to our colleagues in diversity inclusion and UAIR, they've put together a fantastic dashboard which allows us to monitor this over time, especially with our leadership, so they're aware of some of those practices that are in place, not only about recruiting diverse faculty and staff, but also retaining them here, because that's an incredible component of our servingness as HSI. One assessment that we partnered with Faculty Affairs on is looking at compositional diversity from a framework of student and faculty equity gaps. This was helpful to draw attention to that difference where we enroll a lot of Latinx students. However, we have not been able to hire and retain a lot of tenure eligible Latinx faculty. And again, a critical component, of course, is the representation that our students have, and they're seeing that with our staff and faculty members, in particular the faculty that they're taking classes with. And we have here an indicator that we especially have work to do. And this was helpful to generate a lot of conversation within the university and really focus and strengthen a lot of our recruitment efforts that are recruiting faculty of color. One area that we can assess as a structure for serving is within the program and service participation. This is routinely done at the University of Arizona, especially within our SSRI area through Laura Andrews. As you can see here, this is showing among first-year students, which is about 28% over all population, we have the percent of Latinx first-time students who are participating in these SLED programs. So this is providing an indicator and evidence to support that these programs are demonstrating servingness. They are being accessed by Latinx students and serving them from that perspective, a participation access lens. Later on, we'll be looking at a little bit more of the impact piece. Campus Health, thanks to some recent funding through HSI initiatives and the kind of CARES Act funding that was provided there, has really done a deep dive in their program and service data, but also looking at various different assessments that they have already completed to see how access is happening and experiences within the health and wellness dimensions is occurring for different groups of students, in particular looking at race ethnicity. So on this chart, which was one of many that has been shared, we see the UA population of Latinx students is 26%, and the usage of CAPS is 21%. One response to some of these quantitative data is focus groups that are happening right now, next Tuesday, and one was yesterday. And they're asking some follow-up questions to better understand our students of color in terms of what they're looking for in terms of mental health at the University of Arizona. And one structure for serving that I think a lot of campuses, of course, have is the Student Emergency Fund, thanks to Dr. Lin Zhang here, who manages this dashboard and a lot of the data side. We had 40,000 plus applicants come through the Student Emergency Fund process, which was an enormous service to our students. And it was incredibly helpful for Lynn to really provide this dashboard and have different filters. Highlighted here, we have Pell recipient status and iPad ethnicity, to see if the Student Emergency Fund was being accessible to all students, in particular from an equity lens or lower income and students of color. This was able to demonstrate that in fact was, or maybe situations we need to rethink our marketing communication campaign to make sure that we were reaching the right students about that application. Not only looking at those who did apply, but also those who were rewarded and why. One assessment that took place as a structure of serving was really looking at our transition through COVID-19 to an online remote-based classroom experience and learning condition. Instead of just looking at the aggregate level report, which was shared quite widely, we also shared follow-up subpopulation summaries to really illustrate that the aggregate or the average experience of limited internet access, which you see as this call-out box here, or lack of appropriate technology, is not the same across all groups of students. This was really important for us to also think about our Native American students and ensuring that they have appropriate access to technology or Wi-Fi that was essential during this time for classroom learning. One study that took place in spring 2021 and continues through focus groups this academic year is on student basic needs. Similarly, we did do one report here, and we provided some breakouts with some really effective data visualization components that help to illustrate that food insecurity is not the same across all student populations, and we should be really thinking about our policies and practices to ensure that we are responding to this assessment result. Kendra and I were speaking yesterday about this presentation, and we both kind of came to a conclusion on really the importance of mixed method approaches to these assessments, but think about assessing structures for serving as well as indicators of servingness. And we always are kind of favorable of taking that approach, but we also recognize we don't always have the resources and time to do that. However, one opportunity we did have to employ that mixed methods approach was this student basic needs study where we did the survey, had some information from that survey, which of course is a little bit more, smaller depth, and we wanted to go a little bit deeper. And focus groups was a way to do that, where we were able to have, I think it was 4 distinct focus groups focused on students who indicated some set of needs within the student basic needs area, and we were able to ask follow-up questions about how can we better enhance our resources and services so that they're accessible and helpful to you. And one takeaway was really focused on how different cultural perceptions and backgrounds can shape the way students identify within basic needs, but also take advantage of the resources that are in front of them. And this will be put together as a report in the near future, and that will be shared with different decision makers, as well as working with our Student Basic Needs Coalition as they're doing some more strategic planning here. So not only do we want to look at those structures, right, and determine if they're working or not, and for whom, we also want to go back to that piece on the conceptual framework that Marla described about assessing the student validation and the racialized experiences that are happening within those structures. One common way to do that I think a lot of universities undertake is through the campus climate study. This is an illustration of an example that was from our last campus climate survey in 2016. It is notable that we'll be redoing our campus climate approach for all students, all staff and faculty at this point in spring 2023, and that'll be led by Dr. Jane Pizzolato from Diversity Inclusion, as well with help from Lynn Zhang. And we just kind of boxed out here the illustration of looking at these type of experiences as well from a racialized experience perspective. And we asked, have you heard faculty express negative or stereotypical views about race, ethnicity, immigration and immigrants. And we did see within the race ethnicity breakouts here in significance testing that African Americans were more likely to say, yes, they have heard these negative and stereotypical viewpoints compared to white and students who had 2 or more races. We do not see any significant findings for Latinx students here. However, we do see that Latinx students were more likely at a significant difference to report hearing more negative and stereotypical views about immigration and immigrants from faculty. And these are critical data points that really need to inform the conversations we're having with faculty, with the campus community, broadly speaking. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Lynn and Jane a little bit more as they're right now starting to rethink what the campus climate study is going to look like in spring 2023. Another example of a kind of structure we have, but really this is a way to look at assessing the type of racialized experiences students are having within that structure, including staff and community experiences, is a bias education and support team, or BEST. This is also something that Dr. Lynn Zhang here oversees with her colleagues and partners in Dean of Students Office. And this was preliminary data that assessment research and Lynn worked on developing. We're starting to understand who are the impacted persons from different incident reports that are communicated through this BEST initiative, and what other demographics and who are the individuals that have been identified for really creating that incident, right? So they're the remedy contacts in this table, which are the persons we need to reach out to and likely provide some education and development opportunities so they understand the impact that was caused. And now we're going to hand it over to Kendra here for assessing academic and non-academic outcomes.
Thank you, Lucas. So as we think about kind of the framework that Marla presented, we are also, of course, as an academic institution, really accountable for looking at and tracking traditional metrics such as retention and graduation rates. And a relatively new dashboard that we find an exciting development at the University of Arizona is a diversity inclusion website offering the ability to examine and track these outcomes, traditional metrics of retention and graduation by subgroup to continue to keep those disaggregated time points and data points at the fore. Another example of assessing academic outcomes is really at the within class by class type. And here we're looking at an example of an assessment that looked at DFW rates, so drop, fail, and withdrawal rates by STEM course to see if there were gaps in these rates between non-Hispanic and Hispanic students. And what's exciting about an assessment like this and the way it was used here at the University of Arizona is that identifying these equity gaps and the results here were then leveraged to receive a successful HSI Title III grant that will then fund numerous programs over the next 5 years to decrease these gaps that we see here. Another innovative program that is set to launch soon, led by Dr. Sarah Kite here and others, is a faculty fellows program that looks to utilize an equity dashboard to help cohorts of faculty fellows redesign their gateway courses to alleviate equity gaps. So both working with faculty to understand where those gaps lie and then supporting them in redesigning courses and reassessing the progress on the back end. So taking again from your retention and graduation rates into the classroom and then into the faculty conversation as a really important way of assessing and improving academic outcomes for our students. Outside the classroom, there's certainly also an interest in understanding how co-curricular programs impact academic outcomes, such as graduation rates. Shown here was an evaluation that was done of an assurance program, Arizona Assurance Program here at the university that serves students through a combination of funding support and strategic student success program support, primarily targeting low-income students. And here what we were able to show is not only that this program has a positive lift overall, breakouts by first gen and Latinx students compared to subgroups showed us that we saw an even greater value for this subset of students. So when we're thinking about taking programs to scale, identifying not just those that are impactful, but those areas that have an even greater positive effect for the students that we're interested in serving from a Hispanic Serving Institution lens. Of course, we know that student success does not stop at completion, and our assessment must really evaluate how students are experiencing their post-graduation outcomes in terms of continued higher education or employment. And our colleagues at the Student Engagement and Career Development have really expanded our utilization of our graduating senior survey, which is taken by all graduating seniors to better understand their plans and their securement of employment, as well as reflecting on their experience and satisfaction with the university, conversations they've had with faculty about career goals and so forth. And really digging in and taking not only the top line report across all students, but better understanding how our Hispanic and Latinx students experience their outcomes and where we might see improvements. And lastly, we're also interested in understanding our alumni outcomes. So our university has participated in a number of external collaborations, including the Gallup-Purdue Index study on Arizona alumni, to look at the long term, right? So we are excited to bring in, recruit, retain, graduate, and have students who have really great experiences here. But in understanding the course of our impact and our servingness long term, continuing the conversation about how our alumni are doing, specifically how our Latinx alumni are doing, is an important framework to follow as well. So in the last few slides, we wanted to move to a few recommendations, and this certainly is not an exhaustive list. And I think in the conversation that follows, we'll look to hear your respective perspectives and recommendations relative to ways to improve assessing servingness. But here are just a couple of recommendations that we offered here. And starting with a culturally responsive lens. So in terms of how you approach your analysis, we're going to start by talking about kind of just the ways in which you are reflective in your practice and consider kind of the approach before digging into kind of specific data decisions. And so one of the top recommendations that we would suggest is just an examination of the unconscious bias that's inherent in the assessment process. And this includes not only self-reflection from the positionality of those who are engaged in the work, this also includes engaging a diverse team. And we mean diverse not only in the terms of background and personal characteristics, but also in professional roles, identities, and positions as stakeholders. For example, in a program evaluation, including both the folks who understand the assessment piece as well as the facilitators of the program really bring an important lens and context that ensures the recommendations or the insights that you're conveying have true meaning on the ground and can be used in a meaningful way to improve or make suggestions for continuous improvement. The second thing, and related to this, so I've got a list here of, or an image rather, of a book that our assessment team has undertaken to read as a professional development opportunity, and we would consider recommending this as well as an opportunity to read about how traditional methods, specifically quantitative methods, were developed in the historical context of white supremacy. So an opportunity to step back and consider not only your own positionality, but the methods and the ways in which they are used to either improve equity, rather. So another recommendation would be to involve various HSI stakeholders, as Marla suggested, including students where appropriate in the assessment process. If including students directly is not feasible for resource constraints or what have you, retaining a mindful approach of the student populations. And one recommendation here would be to utilize inclusive and purposeful language. For example, self-reporting demographics to really allow students to express the full range of their identities as a way to engage and understand intentionality and the sense of belonging that who you are across a variety of dimensions is welcome and appreciated. And lastly, translating the data into data-informed stories to really increase stakeholder support. We know that leadership time is limited, and we know that data literacy varies widely across departments, across professionals. And so taking that additional step to really translate insights and assessment findings into something that is appropriate and usable for the audience at hand really helps to increase stakeholder support and to drive home the takeaway meaning of not only finding important insights, but being able to really use those for continuous improvement. And so engaging your stakeholder through the sharing of data insights is an important step to close the loop in your assessments. And then certainly we recommend some specific methodological choices when digging into an assessment project relative to Servingness. And one of those would be to leverage existing data first. We know that survey fatigue is high among students, and that the universities in general collect a lot of information that perhaps isn't leveraged to the full extent. And so a first kind of best practice would be to see what already exists at the institution and utilize that first before collecting additional data, both to maximize resources and also not to tax students with additional surveys or information gathering efforts unless that really has a value added and can be identified as such at the onset. Secondly, making disaggregation a priority. I think we've shown that in some of our examples, but really helps to identify both the differential outcomes in terms of equity gaps, as well as programs that are making a really differential and powerful impact. And one component here, which again, we've been thrilled to see happen here, is to automate this option within existing dashboards. So building partnerships with your institutional research or business intelligence team at other institutions to automate that disaggregation process and to make that kind of baseline standard rather than something that's special or above and beyond. We also recommend that you consider survey weighting or alternative sampling framing for data collection when it's appropriate to collect new data. We know from existing student surveys at our institution that we often find white, female, and graduate professional students are more likely to respond. So considering the generalizability and the representation of your data leads you to think more strategically about how you might either use a stratified sampling frame to ensure that you have the population that the voice needs to be reflected, or some survey weighting processes on the back end. And relatedly, to conduct just significance testing between groups as well as interaction effects to really illustrate the differences and consider the intersectionality and differential effects by subgroup, which again, we think some of those examples that we've provided really show the value added of taking this approach. And lastly, again, considering inclusive and self-report demographics in your instruments. And then not listed here, but Lucas did mention, considering a mixed method approach where appropriate to really be inclusive of student voice and perspective where possible. What we've provided here is just a few of the resources that we would recommend if you'd like to take a deeper dive, including some toolkit items from our own work here, as well as some publications from the Student Affairs Leadership SAL group, as well as the National Institute for Learning Outcomes relative to embedded equity. So with that, I will hand it back to Lucas to guide us through some kind of critical thinking about our own work and sharing best practices.
Yeah, thank you. And just for those who are joining here, this is being recorded, so we will send it out to those who were not able to join us this morning and to you, and we can make these slides available as a PDF, knowing there's many links embedded throughout it. So you can click on those, see examples, or see those resources that Kendra kindly offered. And we would like to take the next 10 minutes here or so to really apply this learning. I know it's hard to really dedicate that time, especially in this time of the year with mid-April as we close out the spring semester, to think about how we can apply these principles and assessment of servingness and indicators of servingness in our practice. But if you could, please take 1 or 2 minutes and just mentally or physically write down what is one assessment practice you will take to support that commitment to servingness on any project that you're undertaking? And I'm going to do the same myself. All right. So it would be great to hear at this time if anyone wants to share their assessment practice that they kind of took away from this session or others like it, that you plan to provide that commitment towards assessing servingness moving forward. And we certainly want to invite those who may be joining remotely to certainly provide that sharing.
Jerry.
So I'm Jerry Perry with the University of Arizona Libraries. I'm the Associate Dean, and assessment in the libraries reports to me. Although we still haven't replaced our assessment librarian, so I am doing that work too. But one of the things that we're doing now in the libraries is we're refreshing our strategic plan. We just got through with a reorganization that we call Future State, and led to our creating, and in fact, a unit within one of our departments that's focused on student success. And one of the things that we're doing in our plan, using a tool called Notion, which is kind of a fun technology, it's allowing us to tag various actions that we are undertaking in commitment to the priorities that we've identified. And we've got 5 priorities, one of which, of course, is that student servingness component. And although we're in a prototype phase right now, we haven't finished the language. We just had an all-staff conversation about this week. But one of the tags that we're using is around servingness for diverse students. What this will allow us to do, of course, is as our departments generate actions, we can tag them with this component so that we can very readily identify which ones have that component. And then with each action, we have an expectation of there being a representation of accomplishment and assessment for purposes of accountability, of course. And then we can then identify what those are. Where it'll be challenging as it is always is identifying what is the right assessment metric, what is the right accomplishment to measure. And so I'm really interested in this conversation largely around those programmatic things and the way that we can sort of assess those. Many of the things that were mentioned, I think, are things that we have incorporated into practice. It's at the point of programmatic impact that I think that we really need to drill down. I'll stop because I can go on, but that's
brilliant.
The kind of stuff that we're doing.
Looking forward to seeing that. Sure.
I love hearing you go on, by the way. I'm always really impressed by everything that's happening.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm in student success. And one of the things that I got out of your great presentation was the importance of disaggregation, when we do our work, and so many of the examples, they can be as simple as breaking out and taking a look at how these structures are serving our Latinx population or other key populations on our campus. So that is definitely something I'd like to kind of make more routine in my work whenever possible, even if the explicit ask isn't necessarily around, diverse students from diverse backgrounds. So that's a nice kind of tangible step. And as I mentioned, I do have to run, but I was wondering if, just a thought that occurs to me is because disaggregation is so important, because, significance testing and interactions are so important. I'm kind of just sensing a need from some of our assessment folks on campus that there might be a little bit of a need for some capacity building in those techniques. So that might be a nice kind of like very technical step too, if you're not thinking about it already, as like a workshop to really have folks feeling more empowered about how to do those analyses and then how to talk about the findings.
Love it.
Yeah,
Thank you so
Sarah.
much.
Thank you for joining us.
I don't know Sarah is leaving, but I can relate, like the same takeaway point as disaggregations. And then when we were, I'm from the Dean of Student Office, we have some data on student code of conduct and academic integrity. I've been working for years, but I've never thought like looking at from like Latino or Hispanic students' perspective. So this is definitely the main thing that I'm gonna come back and look at them and to see if there's anything noticeable or we can provide more support to our like specific SDC groups.
Mhm.
Thanks, thank you.
Yeah, anyone on Zoom? No, yeah, certainly at this point, we're really open to any questions that folks have about the topics that we explored today. And for those that do want to stick around and may have time, we're happy to provide a little bit more individualized consultation on assessment projects you might be working through. We can create Zoom breakout rooms for those joining remotely for that individualized input. But thank you so much for being here. Any questions that were remaining for folks remotely or in person?
Yeah, otherwise we'll be sure to share all of this.
Yeah.
And there's lots of hyperlinks embedded throughout, so I think it's a rich in resources. So we look forward to sharing that with you.
And there's our contact information.
Yeah, please reach out. Yeah.
A comment I'd just like to make it and follow up what Sarah was saying. There's an interesting tension that we experience in our organization around disaggregation. And I